Good morning, ladies and gents, and welcome back to this week's overview for English 101. We are so close to being done, guys. So I know it's easy as the weather is beautiful and warm, as different graduation ceremonies are ramping up, especially for the high schools, but CBC has theirs getting lined up as well. I know it's very easy to think about being done for the summer, but I just want to encourage you to continue pushing forward. We're almost there. We're so close, but there are a lot of points still on the table in this quarter, so I want to make sure that we're still striving hard to earn those points so that ultimately you can get the score you need in this class to continue forward in your academic journey, whether that's getting admitted to a competitive program like dental hygiene or nursing or any of the engineering fields where you need a very high GPA. I just want to encourage you, there are still a lot of points left, so please invest, please don't just coast to the end. We're almost there. It's very tempting to coast, but keep pushing forward. We are so close. So as you take a look at our calendar this week, you've turned in the Project 2 Trial by Media essay. I'm so excited to be reading those. So I will be looking at those in the coming weeks and getting those scored for you. And then we're moving on to our final project. Guys, final project, woohoo! This is going to be Project 3, and I designed this project, obviously, before current events took place. I've been teaching this English 101 class at CBC for the last 3 years, and have used this essay for the last 3 years because I felt like it was an important conversation for us to have as people pursuing an education. Looking at bias, looking at culture, and then all of this comes under that heading of justice that we've been talking about in class. In Murder on the Orient Express, we looked at justice versus revenge, how we might define those terms, how they're significantly different or how they're similar. In our last project, Trial by Media, we talked about our Sixth Amendment rights to a fair and impartial jury and how the ways in which we talk about things and share information could potentially be problematic in somebody attaining justice. As we go into Project 3, we're looking at how bias might impact whether someone can get justice. And so this week, we are going to be reading an article called Where Bias Begins. Just like with our past two projects, this article, Where Bias Begins, is a great one to use for your project. You're going to need outside research for Project 3. This is an excellent article to include as a part of that outside research, just like the Leon Seltzer article was for Justice and Revenge in our first project, just as the article Trial by Media Undermines the Courtroom was good for Project 2. Where Bias Begins is a great source for Project 3. So not only do you have an assignment designed around it, but it's a great source to help you get started. Then on Thursday, I'm asking you to take a test called the Implicit Bias Association Test. This test I found was really interesting. It's put forward by a couple Ivy League universities who have very strong psychology programs, and they are looking at what kind of implicit bias people might have. And implicit is a word we don't use terribly often in our everyday conversation, but what it means in this context is a bias we don't know exists. So implicit means that it is something we are not aware of. And so this bias association test is very telling because it asks just for quick fire reactions during the test. And so you're just pressing keys as you see images, so you don't have time to like think through and say, what is the correct answer for this? They're just getting your initial gut level responses. And research has shown that that is indicative of implicit characteristics. So take a look at that implicit bias association test. It is an assignment, so do make sure you finish it. You can pick whatever test you want to take. I've got instructions on how to go through this test, but I'm just going to walk you through it real quick here. The opening screen tells you a little bit about the test. And what I love is that this disclaimer says, if you don't like what the test tells you, you can't sue them, which cracks me up because if you're going to be willing to take an implicit bias test and you find out you have some bias, like, you took the test so you can find it. So I'm not sure why you would be terribly offended. But this disclaimer just says, this test might tell me I have a bias, and if it does, I can't sue you. So they've got their heinies covered. It just cracks me up that this is something that has to be said before somebody can take a test. So this implicit bias project allows you to pick a test. So if you want to see if you have bias in terms of how you might think about or interact with any of these groups, Native Americans, Asian Americans, those who are differently abled, transgender individuals, folks with different skin tones, race, how weapons are worked with, if you have a bias toward a particular gender, particularly in science, that's interesting, or in career, if you've got a bias about religion or sexuality. We have a whole bunch of really interesting stuff here. The only one I would ask you not to take is the president's bias, just because we all have political leanings, right? So that's not a surprise. If you're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I lean this way over this way, Republican or Democrat, we all have a pretty good idea of that. So this is not going to give you any new information, if that makes sense. So I ask that you pick something else besides that test. So if you pick the president's test, it doesn't count for the points for the assignment. You can do it on your own time. Absolutely, have fun. But pick anything other than that, and you'll be good to go. Do we have a bias about weight, or perhaps age, or Arabic descendancy? All kinds of things we could check to see if we have an implicit, which means an unconscious, we're not aware that it's there, kind of bias. For example, I took this test yesterday and found out that I have an implicit bias revolving around age, which is something I was not aware of because I have good relationships with folks who are significantly older than me, I think grandparent age. But it turns out I do have a slight automatic preference for people younger. So the great thing about the implicit bias test, and we're going to learn about this in our PowerPoints this week, is that the wonderful thing about bias is bad, right? In most cases. But the wonderful thing about bias is that it can be changed. Our brains have something called neuroplasticity, which means it's not concrete in here, right? Things can move, things can change. It is a difficult thing to change them. It takes repetitive, conscious action over time to make significant changes. But the first step in making a change is being aware that something needs to be changed, right? And so we're going to be taking the implicit bias test this week. The assignments for you here. You go through the implicit bias test, take a screenshot at the end where it tells you your results, and then I've asked you to answer a couple questions about those results. Did it surprise you? Why do you think this bias exists? Now that you know it exists, what can we do moving forward? So that's the implicit bias association test. Just wanted to give you a blurb on that, especially during this particular moment in time. Gosh, guys, 2020 has been insane, right? And it just keeps getting crazier. So in the midst of our coronavirus pandemic, of course, I'm sure you've been looking at the news, or if you don't watch news, Instagram and Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, everything is revolving around the racial protests right now. And so this project, number 3, feels very timely because it asks us to look at bias, which is what we're being asked to do as a country right now, is to look at what kind of biases we might have, how they might affect people, and how we might make meaningful and significant change in order to create a more just environment for all American citizens and people around the world, but particularly something our nation is dealing with right now. So we've got some good ideas to discuss this week, looking at where bias begins and taking the implicit bias association test. Next week, we're going to be looking at culture and bias and how it might impact justice. I'll have a case list for you for Project 3, and then we're going to dig into some heavier research for this project. So I'll have videos posted. You're going to be creating an annotated bibliography, which is basically a research journal that says, here are the sources I found, here's why I think they're good sources, here's how I might use them in my essay. All that's going to be coming up next week. So this week is a little bit lighter. You pushed hard last week to get Project 2 done. We get to take a bit of a breather as we tackle some big concepts and big ideas. And then next week, we're going to be getting into the nitty-gritty details of Project 3. Once we get through Project 3, We're going to do some peer review. You're going to turn in your annotated bibliographies. And then you turn in your final project and you're done. I'm going to talk more about this in the coming weeks, but the exit essay is only required if you did not earn a passing score on the diagnostic essay. So the very first thing you did in this class was write a diagnostic essay. It was worth 50 points. If you scored 30 points or higher, that's a 60%. If you earned 60%, you do not have to take the exit essay. If you earned below 60%, less than 30 points on the diagnostic essay, then you do have to take the exit essay. I'll be sending emails out to those people as a reminder as well, but if you want to look ahead, just check your score on the diagnostic essay to see if you will need to take that exit essay assignment. Fabulous, guys. Keep pressing forward. Stay safe and healthy out there. Take care of each other, be kind, and reach out if you have any questions.